Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that you decided to join me to take a look at U.S. history. We try to take a look at U.S. history from a variety of different angles, try to identify the story behind the story. Sometimes we try to look at the odd things that have happened, and certainly examine the personalities that have made the American experience so unique in all the history of the world. In particular, we take a look at the U.S. Constitution, this wonderful document that has governed this country for well over 200 years. And we try to understand some of the complications and some of the problems that we face as a nation, day by day, year by year, month by month. In any event, I hope you're enjoying this and that you come back often, because I will keep repeating these and posting them to YouTube so that you can relive the experience if you want to do it more than once. And I hope you do. Anyway, welcome and enjoy the presentations. To excuse the video quality on some of the videos that you're going to see. Some just are not great. They're movie tone things and so forth from the 1950s, and especially the sound is very bad. But I wanted to include them because you saw many of these things on television as you watch the news, and so they will bring back memories even if you can't exactly understand what the commentator is saying. So what we're taking a look at today is Vietnam. And we're going to start with a brief overview of their early history. Some of the key events, the creation of French Indochina, some French resistance that they were very good at, and Japanese occupation during World War II. A little bit of a history of Vietnam. Vietnam is an old country. It goes back to at least 200 BC, and some of the things I read, it could run back to 500 BC. And it was a tribal country. For over 1,000 years, however, the Chinese ruled. Now, most of the Chinese who ruled there were more likely from southern China, not necessarily the Han, who are the majority group in China. But the Chinese influence, of course, is extensive. And while Vietnamese culture is unique, it also has very great Chinese influences. More than a dozen dynasties have ruled over time. The Europeans discovered Vietnam in the 16th century as they began to explore the rest of the world. They finally had these fabulous ships with their sails that could now reach corners of the world that had never been reached before. France became interested in Vietnam in the 19th century and eventually conquered the nation along with Laos and Cambodia. This was imperialism, and it led to colonialism. Now, all of the nations of Europe practiced this. They took Africa and they carved it up, and they took Latin America and carved it up, and they took Asia and carved it up. And this was just the French influence. France was a little bit late to the party, but this is what they got. They were firmly in control by 1893, and of course, they were exploiting the economic wealth of this area. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia became what is known as French Indochina. Here is a picture that's very famous, a traditional Vietnamese warrior. And the French assault on Hung Hoa Citadel in 1884 is depicted in this very complicated Chinese or Asian painting. The French revolt, the Vietnamese resisted strongly. They hated the French, and they revolted and started in the 1880s until 1913. Here are some scenes from historic Vietnam, and of course you see the Chinese influence, but again, if you were an expert on this, you would also see the unique things that are only found in Vietnam itself. Here are the map of the three countries. Laos is quite primitive even today. Cambodia, also pretty primitive, although it has more development in some of the cities. And Vietnam has become a pretty modern nation, comparatively speaking, economically a powerhouse. French Indochina, those three countries. In the World War II, during World War II, France was defeated and it was occupied by Germany in 1940. As a result of that, Japan, seeing an opportunity, took advantage and invaded the French colonies and ruled through a puppet government that they installed. Nationalist communist leader Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh, who fought both the Japanese and Vichy French. Now, Ho Chi Minh was actually a very well-educated man, and he was educated in Paris, in France, and he was not a dummy. And one of his heroes was Thomas Jefferson. We didn't ever really read him correctly. After the US entered World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, which is later the Central Intelligence Agency, sent US agents to Vietnam. These men helped to train the Viet Minh and promised Ho Chi Minh that the United States would support his goal for Vietnamese independence after the war. Ho Chi Minh believed after the war that the United States would support him, but he did not see, nor did most of the world, exactly how the Cold War was going to unfold pre or post World War II. The Indochina War, which lasted for 9 years from 1945 to 1954, in which the communists gained support. Now, communism is one of those things that if you just read about it on paper, it sounds pretty darn good. And to the primitive peasants of this country, it sounded like the way to run a country. So they had a lot of support. The French said, all right, it's our colony, we're coming back, just as Great Britain did with its colonies, and so forth. But the war began. By now, they didn't want the French. The US, being a close ally of France, we provided support. France is then ultimately defeated at the very famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh believed the US would not allow France to reoccupy the former colony since the OSS had promised that to the Minh during the war. When French soldiers returned to reclaim their colony, a bitter 9-year war began that ended in a French defeat and humiliation that divided Vietnam into two halves. The North became communist, while the South was under US influence. The 1945 Ho Chi Minh and the communist Viet Minh gained the goodwill of many Vietnamese when they provided relief from a devastating famine that killed almost 2 million people. Food does motivate people. The famine was caused in large part by the Japanese.
Desert their homes and flee southward rather than live under a communist regime. From then to now, the basic story of United States help to Vietnam is simple. The communists have steadily increased their pressure on South Vietnam. South Vietnam has asked for greater support to resist that pressure and has received it. So increasing communist aggression has called forth increases in the scope of United States counteraction.
Okay. During Japanese occupation, small independent cells in the remote areas built Japanese resistance. This established a network of supporters throughout the country before the French attempted to reoccupy Vietnam in 1945. They just transferred their resistance to the Japanese to the French. Ho Chi Minh also trained teams to tour villages and practice what was known as agitprop, agitation and propaganda. This turned people into supporters of the NLF by pointing out that the injustices practiced by the Japanese and French occupiers. The French returned to Vietnam to reclaim its colony in 1945, and you'll notice where that tank is sitting. It's sitting in a rice paddy. Not good territory for tanks. Tanks need firm ground in order to be effective. 1945, May of 1950, President Truman authorized $15 million in economic and military aid to the French, who were fighting to regain control of French Indochina, including Vietnam, as part of the aid package. And note this number: Truman also sent 35 military advisors. This is 1950, 35 military advisors. Seemed like the right thing to do. Here are French soldiers on patrol in 1951. And notice what lovely conditions they're slogging through. Jungle and paddies, and it just was you could not have picked a more miserable place to have a war or fighting, probably, than anywhere in the world than Vietnam was and would still be if we ever went back again, which, God willing, we will never do. Okay. Now, it happened that General Giap stepped up the war against the French from 1949 to 1953. And this, while he's not Ho Chi Minh, he's as brilliant in many ways as Ho Chi Minh. French officials and Vietnamese who cooperated with the French were assassinated, isolated military outposts were attacked, and military convoys were ambushed. These escalated attacks led the French to abandon their remote military outposts, and they evacuated most of Vietnam. So by the time we get to the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they don't own much or don't occupy much anymore. Oh, here we go.
Of the civilians, like this old man who greets us politely, then passes on.
That was it. French. That was just a short newsreel from the French Indochina War. Here, the Viet Minh attacked at Dien Bien Phu. The last year of the war, the Viet Minh changed tactics and attacked large army units with success in 53 and 54. We'd gone to the movies in the 40s or into the early 50s. This is the kind of thing you would have seen in reporting on what was happening in this far off place that nobody understood, couldn't pronounce the names. It was a foreign place to everybody.
Where were they getting their arms from?
From France, and indirectly from the United States. We were
but the Vietnamese.
From China and the Soviet Union. Yeah, from China and the Soviet Union, they became the supporters. So, yeah, fellow communist nation, you see. And so, the French sought a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam based on their air superiority, which they did. The Vietnam War was 100% controlled by air power. Or the air power part of it was controlled by the French in the beginning and the United States from that point forward. The Vietnam brought artillery through the jungle and used it against the base and cut off air support. After 6 months, the French surrendered at Dien Bien Phu and agreed to withdraw from Vietnam. So why? Why did they get beaten? Well, first of all, remember that France fought World War I. And it was exhausting. And then it was just, one generation later, they fought World War II. They were occupied by Germany during World War II. France was weary, tired of war. The French troops were not prepared for guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is a particularly different kind of a warfare. There's no way to describe it, and most of the military manuals and training up to that time had not accounted for it. Today, I think armies are better prepared to deal with it, in part because they avoid it. But in those days, nobody knew what they were doing. Colonialism in the general world had lost its support, and so Great Britain lost its colonies. Germany had had its colonies taken away from it. Belgium lost the Congo, on down the line. The only one who kept her territories is the United States. We kept Puerto Rico, and we kept the Philippines for a while, but even that disappeared. Philippines disappeared by the end of World War II.
We occupied Japan too.
Huh?
We occupied
Japan. As a matter of fact, I was doing this in the context of entirely different research. We have American troops in over 200 stations around the world. Did you realize that we have actual military stations in over 200 places? And I don't mean the embassies. I mean actual troops in 200 places around the world. The Vietnam had intelligent leaders in Giap and Ho. After 1950, the Vietnam were supported by the Chinese and the Soviets. The terrain was ideal for guerrilla warfare. Lots of water and rice pads and jungles, heat, oppressive heat, disease. Yeah, it was awful. The Vietnam also were popular among the Vietnamese for resisting the Japanese and French colonial powers. Now, Eisenhower gets into the picture. So 1953, he becomes president. What's his Vietnam policy? Well, we get the Geneva Accords. CETO is formed. The domino theory. Eisenhower pledged U.S. support for South Vietnam and Ngo Dien Diem. 1958, the communist forces at South Vietnam. National Liberation of Vietnam formed in 1960. So let's take a look at those individually. Here's Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles with South Vietnamese President Ngo Dien Diem, Washington, 1957. In July of 1954, the Geneva Accords were signed, dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel for 2 years until elections could be held to unify the nation. The North became communist and the South an anti-communist regime tied to the US. And here is the convention.
This is Movie Town. Lionel Gamlin reporting. The Palais des Nations, where the League of Nations wrestled with international problems many years ago now, is the handsome setting for the Geneva Conference. Seen here, arriving to play their part in the discussions are the Chinese delegates. They're led by Mr. Chou En-lai, the foreign minister. Cameras were right on the spot. One in particular looked as if it really meant business. Chinese certainly appeared to be in very cheerful mood as they waited for the Russian delegation to arrive. Their leader, of course, was Mr. Molotov, who exchanged warm greetings with Mr. Chou En-lai. Now the Chinese delegates enter the Palais des Nations. They're shortly followed by Mr. Molotov, accompanied by Mr. Gromyko. Mr. Dulles, the American Secretary of State. Monsieur Bido, France's Foreign Minister. Mr. Pyongyang Tai, the South Korean Foreign Minister. And Mr. Anthony Eden. The opening session, dealing with procedure, was presided over by Prince Won, Siam's Foreign Minister. The assembly for this most important conference is a big one. In addition to the communist delegations, 16 Western nations are represented. Korea and Indochina are the chief problems to be solved.
All right, that was high. No, we don't need that. The Vietnamese refugees fled North Vietnam after the division of the nation in 1954.
More than 1 billion Vietnamese desert their homes and flee southward rather than live under a communist regime. From then to now, the basic story of United States help to Vietnam is simple. The communists have steadily increased their pressure on South Vietnam. South Vietnam has asked for greater support to resist that pressure and has received it. So increasing communist aggression has called forth increases in the scope of United States counteraction.
Okay. And so here we have the leader of the North, President Ho Chi Minh, Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And of course, when the war was over, they renamed Saigon for him. So today it's Ho Chi Minh City. And then this guy, Ngo Dien Diem, president of the Republic of Vietnam. And he has a problem, though. Anyone know what his problem was? Religion. What was his religion?
Catholic.
He was Catholic. What is the country? It's Buddhist, largely. SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, was formed in 1954 as a defensive pact to defend the nations against communist attack. It was modeled on NATO, that North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was disbanded in 1975 after several members quit. It just was not an effective organization. It never achieved anything near what they had dreamed it might be able to do. Then we have the famous domino theory, which really was articulated and espoused by Eisenhower. It's really a Cold War theory based on the idea that if one nation was conquered by communists, the neighboring nations were at risk, and therefore it was the United States' obligation to prevent that from occurring. We had seen what had happened in Eastern Europe when the Soviet Union toppled all of these countries, one after the other, and put them under its wing. First proposed by Eisenhower in 1954. It's the foundation for the war in Vietnam, as well as other Cold War conflicts. Eisenhower and Dulles. Eisenhower appointed John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State, a brilliant man, capable man, and consulted him on foreign policy issues throughout his presidency. Very few presidents have depended upon their Secretary of State to the extent that Eisenhower depended on Dulles. And Dulles did something that had never been done by Secretaries of State. He traveled extensively, almost constantly. I remember reading an article at one time where they commented on John Foster Dulles on one of his recent visits to the United States. He was gone a lot all around the world. And that same meeting that I had an earlier picture of. The U.S. supported Catholic Ngo Dien Diem, who was hated by the majority of the South Vietnamese who were Buddhist. His misrule led to a small rebellion which grew into a major war in the 1960s. Eisenhower sent a small training unit to help build his Diem's army in 1955. Now, watch this number. From 1955 to 61, Eisenhower sent 200 million in aid and around 675 military advisors. Remember, Truman sent 35, and now we're up to 675. Eisenhower's policy on Vietnam did not involve troops, however, only monetary contributions and advisors, which really are troops, but that's another question. So this is the National Liberation Flag, Front flag, organized in 1960 by anti-Diem groups. And that was controlled by former communist Viet Minh cadres who had fought against the French. It was ultimately controlled by the North Vietnamese. Eisenhower's Military Advisory and Assistance Group was replaced by the MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, under the command of General Paul Harkins. Over 11,000 advisors with modern weapons and aircraft were sent to help the South Vietnamese government. And that number is going to grow to 16,000 by November of 63, which is when Kennedy, of course, is assassinated. Kennedy's Vietnam policy. JFK felt pressured. Remember, he'd barely been elected as president. He wasn't sure whether he'd be able to be reelected in 1964. He was walking on a political tightrope. So he set combat forces, and he started, and the corrupt government under Diem, it was a very corrupt government. Often in other countries, corruption is common. And of course, we had Kennedy being assassinated. We'll talk a little bit about strategic hamlets. And Kennedy, like any president, did not want to be accused of losing Vietnam in the same way that Truman had lost China. So he increased the number of military advisors from 800 to 16,000. And it's also during his presidency that the Green Berets are formed. But the biggest increase now begins to come under Kennedy. That's the important thing.
They call advisors because they were not.
Hello?
Correct. Correct. Yes.
That will change.
All right, Diem was assassinated on November 2nd. Now listen, November 2nd, 1963.
Oh,
Okay.
right before Kennedy.
Just before Kennedy,
Just
that's
before
right.
Kennedy.
That's a very relevant point, and thank you for digging it out, Tomcat. So, yes. Yeah.
That's why,
Anyway, the U.S. military set up schools and clinics in an attempt to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. And the psychological warfare began in 1962. The purpose of psychological operations called PSYOP was to demoralize the enemy by causing dissension and unrest among his ranks, while at the same time convincing the local population to support American troops. The PSYOP units also provided continuous analysis of the attitudes and behavior of the enemy forces to the tactical commanders in the field, so they could be successful. But
Didn't
here
work
are
in
examples of
Vietnam,
the kind of
didn't work in-
propaganda that they
in
were developing and
Afghanistan either.
distributing. There was a lot of stuff that they were trying to put out there to try to, bring people to this, to convert them, if you would. I could not do one of the presentations I actually had the immolation little video, which you can find on YouTube. But I couldn't include that here because they took down my YouTube version of that because of that. You can't have that shown on a YouTube video. But to protest Catholic Diem's attacks on the Buddhist pagodas, Buddhist priests set fire to themselves in protest. The U.S. had decided that Diem's corrupt and murderous regime was too unpopular and supported an army coup that killed Diem. Now, this one is a real honey. This is Madame New, who is the wife of Diem's brother. And I'll play this, but it's hard to understand her. But what she's talking about, the people who are immolating or burning themselves, is they're barbecuing themselves. And then at the end, she mentions, and they're using it foreign gas too. They don't even use their own gasoline. They're using, so anyway, but I want to play it because it's interesting, her attitude. She does, by the way, go on to live.
What have the Buddhist leaders done comparatively? The only thing they have done, they have barbecued one of their monks, whom they have intoxicated, whom they have abused the confidence. And even that barbecuing was done not even with self-sufficient means, because they used imported gasoline.
Yeah, they used imported gasoline. So Madame New, when she escapes Vietnam, she goes on to retire in Rome, and she lives to be 86. So she has a life after Vietnam. And then, of course, you know that we had our own president assassinated November 22nd, 1963. So this is interesting. This is General Paul Harkins on April of 1963. He says, by Christmas, it will be all over. But it wasn't over until 1975, 12 years later, when the communists won and took control of South Vietnam. General Harkin's overly optimistic reports led to a confused understanding of the true situation in Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army was not fighting with any spirit or skill and would lose without a massive U.S. troop deployment. So we had this happen, the strategic hamlets that were developed. The Vietnamese peasants were forced to build and move into fortified villages to prevent contact with communist Viet Cong guerrillas. 6,800 of these were built by 1963, and they were very unpopular. You imagine being rounded up and having to move into another. It didn't work at all. This, along with other abuses by the South Vietnamese Saigon government, caused many then to support the communists. This will show you what they were building.
We are building strategic hamlets to bring peace throughout the country. This was their motto and their code of faith. Volunteers from every class and age, men and women and children, began the hard physical work of construction. First, they broke arable land to make the deep moats and the high fences.
Note it's all by hand.
First came the moat around the entire village. The bamboo spikes, making an ancient but thoroughly efficient protection against invaders, have become the trademark of the strategic hamlets, and each spike is cut and set by willing hands.
Okay, enough of that. So this is a guy who's guarding one of the hamlets. And then we had these blockhouses. Hundreds of blockhouse strong points were built throughout the countryside to protect the peasants from the VC. They were equipped with thousands of rifles and machine guns, most of which wound up in the hands of the VC to be used against the South Vietnamese and Americans. Battle of Ap Bac. This marked a new phase in the Vietnam War. On January 2nd, 1963, only 340 Viet Cong guerrillas held off the combined assaults of more than 1,500 South Vietnamese troops. VC shot down 5 American helicopters, withstood major ground troops. The VC suffered few casualties, much to American advisors' frustrations. This was a warning sign. While understood by the lower level advisors and press, were lost on the senior American civil and military leadership. And this is the key thing. The South Vietnamese army would not fight. So was it worth the lives of American soldiers to defend their nation when they themselves wouldn't do it? That became ultimately the key question, and the answer was no.
This was the only this was the only war that was fought in Washington.
Yes, it was fought in Washington. That's right.
They could not do what they wanted. They had to get Congress to say do it.
Well, and also we didn't really get fully involved like we did in World War II. We were trying to do all of this with bombs and aircraft and so forth, and we never made the full commitment that we could have made. But even if we had made it and we had been 100% successful, at some point you have to leave, or you have to remain permanently as a colony of the United States, and that was not practical.
Well, didn't we have over 100,000 troops there? We had close to 200,000 or 300,000.
Just hold on, we get to that number. It's actually much more than that.
Yeah, so we put a lot of money there.
And we did. We poured enormous amounts of money into it. Guns and butter. We were trying to do both. That was one of Johnson's problems. He was trying to finance both this war as well as his war on poverty and his Great Society and so forth. So now we get to our friend Johnson. And we won't get through all of him, but we're going to get beginning of Johnson's Vietnam policy. His policy team was a group of geniuses. They were noted for that. Robert McNamara at the Ford Motor Company had been a boy wonder. He had done marvelous things for the Ford Motor Company, and he was drafted into the Johnson administration. He was considered a genius, and he was obviously had a very high intelligence. Another one was Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State. These were very strong, powerful, intellectually competent leaders. And then another one, a real egghead, George McBundy on the National Security Council, along with his brother, William Bundy at the Pentagon, were important advisors. Probably not certainly since the beginning days of the Roosevelt administration, this is the greatest assembly of brain power that could have been pulled together. Here are others who were part of that. Walt Rostow, Senator J. William Fulbright from Arkansas, and Secretary of State Clark Clifford were also advisors. So then we have the Tonkin Gulf incident in August of 1964. This is really pivotal. The official story was that North Vietnamese torpedo boats launched an unprovoked attack against a U.S. destroyer on routine patrol in the Tonkin Gulf on August 2nd, 1964. Now, by the way, To keep this in perspective, what is 1964?
Election year.
It's an election year. So this is also makes a difference. And that North Vietnamese PT boats followed up with a deliberate attack on a pair of US ships 2 days later. Evidence uncovered since the event has proven that there was no attack that night. And some have suggested this incident was an excuse to escalate the US involvement in the region.
You can put that speaker on the floor. It doesn't need to be on the couch.
Well, when you say there was no evidence, and there was two attacks separated by 2 days, that
You're on the coin.
apply to both.
That I don't know. I can't speak to that, but generally the evidence of the suggestion is that it was all contrived. But I don't know whether both were contrived or not. The important thing is that the president now uses this event. It's another video.
Destroyers of the United States Navy are assigned routine patrols time to time. Sunday, August the 2nd, 1964, the destroyer Maddox was on such a patrol. Shortly after noon, the calm of the day is broken as general quarters sound.
This is all me.
In a deliberate and unprovoked action, 3 North Vietnam PT boats unleashed a torpedo attack against the
Navy film.
At once, the enemy patrol boats are brought under fire by the destroyer.
Okay, so that was something prepared officially. So the planes from the USS Ticonderoga were immediately sent to attack North Vietnamese naval bases. So this, though, is the important thing that comes out of it. President Johnson proposed a Gulf of Tonkin resolution in August 7th of 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution authorized President Lyndon Johnson to, quote, take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. It does not say Vietnam. It does not say Saudi Arabia. It does not say Russia or Soviet Union. It says any armed attack against forces of the United States. This is a license for the president to become a military dictator. Think about that language. It's wide open. And of course, he uses it. And it is used by Nixon. And finally, they do try to calm this down, and we'll get into that in another discussion. But the resolution passes the House unanimously. No opposition whatsoever, none, not Republicans, not Democrats, and 82-2 in the Senate. Most famously opposed by this man, Senator Wade Morse from Oregon, who was a real rebel in the Senate in his time there. The resolution allowed Johnson to wage all-out war against North Vietnam without ever securing a formal declaration of war from Congress. The last declaration of war that came from our Congress followed December 7th, 1941. Since then, we have fought battles everywhere around the world with no war declared. Okay, so this is Johnson begins to explain why we were fighting in Vietnam, and I'm not going to certainly read this whole long thing. But among the things he said in there was, our power, therefore, is a very vital shield. If we're driven from the field in Vietnam, then no nation can ever again have the same confidence in American promise or in American protection. And to some degree, that is still true. And down at the bottom, then it mentions 3 presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, over 11 years, have committed themselves and have promised to help defend this small and valiant nation. And so we were all in. General Westmoreland was the one who conducted the war. And his strategy was one of attrition, meaning he sought to kill infiltrated indigenous Vietnamese communist soldiers faster than they could replace. And what he wanted to do was avoid another Dien Bien Phu, another humiliating routing as the French had had in 1954. There were 2 major flaws in his plan. One was communist units could avoid the military ban that he had created and continue to fight. Second was that North Vietnam was able to infiltrate communist soldiers into South Vietnam faster than Westmoreland's soldiers could kill them.
Johnson went to the.
He did visit there,
He
that's
did,
correct.
yes, he did.
So we had search and destroy missions. Offensive military operations undertaken by the United States wanted to neutralize the enemy, especially the enemy's strength, when we didn't know exactly where they were and how many of them there were. So the capture and holding of territory, which is what you used to do in war, was not what we were trying to do in Vietnam.
It was impossible.
It was impossible, that's right. U.S. attacks inflicted many casualties on civilians and turned 5 million Vietnamese into homeless refugees. It just disrupted and destroyed the country for ultimately no purpose. Often these search and destroy missions came up empty-handed. And here's pictures of some of them. They were just people, you know, they were trying to live their lives like anybody else. And so we tried defoliation because this jungle was impossible to move and operate in. And so they wanted to clear the vegetation along the highways to make it easier and to deal with the ambushes and so forth. Heavily sprayed areas in the inland forests near the demilitarized zone. Guerrilla trails and base areas were exposed, and crops that might feed the Viet Cong were destroyed, but those crops also would have fed the Vietnamese or the South Vietnamese as well. Vast areas were sprayed with Agent Orange, a very nasty herbicide. No safety precautions were taken with the dangerous chemicals, and soldiers and civilians claimed ill effects for many years after the war ended. And there are hundreds of thousands of people today who are receiving benefits because they were affected by Agent Orange. This defoliation was a terrible thing, no matter how you talk about it. And we had not only Agent Orange, we had Agent Blue and Agent White, and I don't know what each one did, but they each did different things. And there was a lot of herbicide that was delivered all over this countryside. It was a nasty thing to do. The election of 1964 winds up being a landslide for Lyndon Johnson. He gets a validation of who he is and what he's doing. Like almost only, I think Roosevelt's was greater up to that point. And I have to admit, one sin among the many sins I have in life is the first vote I made for president was in 1964 when I was 23 years old, and I voted for Barry Goldwater. I was one of the 27 million who voted for him. Shame on me, but I did. Yeah, so anyway. So anyway, we had Rolling Thunder that occurred, which was a systematic bombing of North Vietnam, and it continued on for the next 7 years. We bomb like crazy. In Vietnam, the U.S. dropped 3 times the tonnage used in all of World War II and 12 times the tonnage used in the Korean War. Neither LBJ nor the American people were willing to resort to the kind of all-out war that we had used in World War II. And we thought we could win this war with massive bombing, and so we just didn't do it. Flight operations, Arclight, devastating aerial raids, B-52 Stratofortress against enemy positions in Southeast Asia. These bombers flew and dropped and dropped and flew and dropped and flew. And the B-52s increasingly became important in dropping tons and tons of bombs. And this is, in fact, a B-52 bomber with over 70,000 pounds of ordnance, including bombs, mines, and missiles. This airplane, which is now 70 years old, is still on the drawing board for another 38 years. They keep modernizing it electronically and otherwise. The engines are replaced and so forth, but this is still such a fabulous bomber. They keep, I think it's 58 are active. There are there are 744 that were built, and they're all within short amount of time, they could all be back flying. They're kept on in reserve, but this B-52, it's a huge hunk of machinery. So, air mobility, the US had complete mastery of the air in Vietnam, and we use helicopters, bombers, and so forth, like extensively. It was a helicopter war to a substantial extent. And we developed and refined our helicopters during that period, and they're still important. Here quickly are tactical weapons, the M16A1 rifle, the main US infantry, still the main, it's still one we're using today. The M60 GPMG general purpose machine gun, the 40 millimeter grenade launcher, and the anti-tank weapons.
And M60 was, you could take a forest, I used it, you could take a forest down.
Yeah,
Trees,
yeah, everybody.
and every fifth bullet was a tracer, so always there was one red line, so you can imagine thousands of bullets.
Well, this is in LBJ in 1964 in the presidential campaign. He said, and I quote here, come on, not going to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. Now, of course, he's going to be elected shortly. By 1965.
People concern themselves something with a country that's trying to maintain her independence from aggression, that's being invaded.
By early 1965, the communists were well on their way to victory, and Johnson had a choice. He either had to increase US involvement or see South Vietnam defeated. And so LBJ announced in July of 1965, the US troops would now engage in direct combat. We hadn't done up to that point, we were advisors, as you pointed out a little while ago. By the end of 1965, there were 180,000 troops in Vietnam. And this grew to 500,000 by 1968. 500,000 troops are there. So now this is LBJ. What he had to say.
Make no mistake about it. I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win.
No idea what you're referring to.
We are going to win.
Make no mistake about
it. And so that becomes the end of part 1 for today. Now, there will be part 2